They pressed a gun to her head and saw why you never threaten a Navy SEAL. Three men walked into the wrong building on the wrong morning and made the worst mistake of their lives. They saw a young woman, 26 years old, brown hair pulled back, 5'3" in flat shoes, a coffee cup in one hand and a key card in the other, standing in the parking lot of an industrial logistics company on the east side of Tucson, Arizona, at 6:47 in the morning. They saw someone easy. They didn't see the calluses on her right hand, the kind that only form after tens of thousands of trigger pulls over 18 years. They didn't notice that she'd already clocked every camera angle in that parking lot before she reached the front door. They didn't catch the way her eyes moved, not the nervous darting of someone startled awake, but the slow, deliberate scan of someone who has never once stopped reading a room in her entire adult life. And they definitely didn't see what happened behind her eyes the moment cold steel touched her temple. That's where this story really begins. Part 1. The Girl in the Crosshairs. Tucson in March has a particular kind of quiet in the early morning. The desert holds its breath before the heat arrives. The sky goes from charcoal to copper to pale blue in a span of 20 minutes, and the light comes in flat and honest, without the softness of places that get more rain. It's the kind of light that shows you exactly what things are. No illusions, no flattery, just the truth of the land laid bare. Maya Hargrove had always liked that about Arizona. She parked in the same spot she always did, third row, far left corner, backed in. Habit. You always back in. You never want to be moving forward blind when you need to leave fast. She'd learned that before she'd learned long division. The logistics company was called Meridian Supply Group. 2 floors concrete and glass surrounded by loading docks and a chain-link perimeter that hadn't been properly maintained in 6 years. Maya had counted 7 structural gaps in that fence on her first day of work. She knew which camera had a 14-second loop delay due to a firmware glitch on the northeast corner unit. She knew the security guard, a retired sheriff's deputy named Harold, took his bathroom break at 6:55 every morning without fail. She knew all of this not because she was paranoid. She knew it because she was trained. Maya took a long sip of her coffee, black, no sugar, no exceptions, and walked toward the building. Her shoes were flat-soled, lightweight, with a wide toe box. She hadn't worn a heel taller than an inch since she was 19 years old. Heels changed your center of gravity. Heels slowed your first step. You never knew when your first step needed to be your fastest. At the front door, she paused. She looked out across the parking lot toward the far end of the street where a white delivery truck sat with its engine off. She gave the faintest nod, barely more than a breath, and pushed through the door. Nobody watching would have understood that nod. They would understand it later. Inside the office was the usual morning stillness. Fluorescent lights humming. The smell of someone else's coffee already brewing. A few early arrivals at their desks, faces tilted toward screens. Maya set her bag down, pulled up her workstation, and scanned the local news feed out of habit. A failed bank robbery in Phoenix. A cartel-linked drug seizure near the border town of Nogales. A city council dispute over water rights. Normal. All of it normal. She closed the feed and reached into her desk drawer. Her fingers found, without looking, the edge of a small, hard-sided case no larger than a paperback novel. She didn't open it. She just let her hand rest there for a moment, feeling the weight of what was inside, the way a man might rest his hand on a Bible before a difficult conversation. Then she closed the drawer, and she waited. 18 years earlier, the light in New Mexico came in the same way. Flat, honest, unforgiving. Maya was 8 years old, standing in a field outside a small property 20 miles south of Albuquerque, and her arms were shaking. Not from fear, from effort. The rifle was almost as long as she was tall, a Remington 700 bolt-action chambered in .308 Winchester, the same round used by Marine snipers for decades. It wasn't a child's rifle. There was no such thing as a child's rifle in Frank Hargrove's world. There were only rifles, and there were only people who knew how to use them and people who didn't. "Stop fighting it," said the voice behind her. Frank Hargrove was 54 years old that morning, but he moved like a man who had never once been comfortable being still. 6'1", wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from old wood, thick and rough, and permanently marked by a lifetime of hard use. His hair had gone silver early, and his face carried the particular weathering of a man who had spent significant portions of his life out of doors in conditions that were trying to kill him. He crouched beside his granddaughter and placed one of those enormous hands gently on her small shoulder. "Don't fight the weight," he said. "Accept it. Let it become part of you." Maya adjusted her grip, stopped resisting, let the rifle settle into her shoulder properly. "Better," he said. "Now, tell me what you see." The target, 200 yards. What else, she thought. Wind, left to right, maybe 5 miles an hour. Maybe, she recalculated, 5 miles an hour. Good. What else? I'm on a slight uphill, maybe 3 degrees. Frank made a sound that was almost approval. You'll adjust down, slightly. The bullet travels further when you're shooting uphill. Gravity doesn't pull it as hard at the beginning of the flight. He paused. Now breathe. She breathed in, breathed out halfway, stopped. Between heartbeats, he said quietly. You'll feel them. Don't fight those either. Just wait. She waited. She felt the deep thump in her chest, waited for the space between. She pressed the trigger. The shot broke clean. The steel plate at 200 yards rang like a church bell in the morning air. Frank stood up slowly the way old injuries make a man stand, and he looked at the target for a long moment. Then he looked at his granddaughter. The gun is not the weapon, he said. She looked up at him. Patience is the weapon. The gun is just the last part of a long conversation. He put his hand on top of her head briefly, the way men of his generation express things they didn't have words for. Remember that? Maya Hargrove had remembered it every single day of her life since. She didn't know, standing in that New Mexico field at 8 years old, that it was the clearest morning she would ever have with him. She didn't know that over the following years, Frank would begin the slow process of stepping back from her life. A missed holiday here, a shortened visit there until the silence between them grew wider than any explanation he offered. She didn't know that in 2009, when she was 11 years old, 2 sheriff's deputies would knock on her mother's door in the early evening and explain that her grandfather had been killed in a single-vehicle accident on a rural highway in Montana, that his truck had gone off an embankment, that there wasn't much left to recover. She didn't know any of that yet. Standing in that field at 8 years old, she just knew that the steel plate was still ringing and that her grandfather was looking at her the way people look at something they are quietly, privately proud of. She breathed out. She set the rifle down, and somewhere in the back of her mind, something permanent took root. 9:23 a.m. The first thing Maya noticed was the door. The main entrance to Meridian Supply Group had a hydraulic closer that brought it gently shut over approximately 4 seconds. She'd timed it. When the 3 men entered, the door swung wide and stayed wide for just a fraction too long, the way it does when people are entering in a deliberate formation, one holding the others moving through. She didn't look up from her screen, but she saw everything. The one in front, heavy-set mid-30s canvas jacket, despite the warming morning, moved to the receptionist's desk immediately and showed her something that made the young woman behind the desk go very still. The second man moved to the main door of the open office floor and stood with his back to the wall, right hand close to his hip. He had a mechanical quality to his stillness. Not calm control. There is a difference, and Maya had learned to read it years ago. The third man walked directly toward Maya, not toward the room in general, not toward a group, toward her specifically with the unhurried certainty of someone who had looked up her workstation location before he arrived. He was around 45, medium build, wearing clothes that were deliberately unremarkable. His face was the kind of face designed to be forgotten, not ugly, not handsome, just neutral. But his posture told a different story. Weight distributed evenly across both feet. Shoulders square without being intense. The practiced stillness of someone with significant physical training somewhere in his past. She called him the messenger in her head, not out loud, because he had the quality of someone delivering a notification on behalf of someone else, a man who gave orders but answered to them too. He stopped beside her desk. Everyone needs to come to the conference room, he said, not loud, not aggressive, quiet and clear the way a man gives an order when he is accustomed to being obeyed. The office complied. There were 7 employees on the floor that morning. Within 2 minutes, they were all in the conference room. The door closed. The heavy-set man, she would come to call him Briggs for the way he held himself like a structure, under load, standing guard outside, and the third man moving through the building to confirm it was otherwise empty. Maya stood at the end of the conference table. The messenger stood across from her. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved in their head. We're going to keep this simple, he said. You're Maya Hargrove. We know who you are. We know what you do. And we know about your grandfather. The room went cold. One of her colleagues, a woman named Patricia, who handled accounts payable and kept photographs of her grandchildren on her desk, made a small, involuntary sound. The others sat with the particular rigid terror of people who have never been in a situation like this and have no framework for it. Maya had a framework. She just didn't show it. She let her shoulders drop slightly, let her jaw loosen, Let her eyes go to the middle distance, the way frightened people's eyes do. It was a performance she could have delivered on a stage. The messenger reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them. A photograph. Black and white printed on standard paper, slightly grainy, the kind of image taken from a distance with a long lens. It showed a man at a gas station. Older, large-framed, silver-haired, standing beside a pump looking down at the transaction screen, one hand in his jacket pocket. The gas station sign in the background read Billings, Montana. The timestamp in the corner read 4 days ago. "Your grandfather is alive," the messenger said. "We've known for some time, and we need to know where he is." Maya looked at the photograph. She looked at it for what felt like a long time. What she was actually doing was running calculations. The messenger was professionally trained, former military or intelligence. She'd stake money on it. The fact that he was here personally meant this wasn't a casual fishing expedition. Someone significant was behind this. The photograph had been taken with precision equipment. They'd had Frank under surveillance, however briefly, and had lost him. They needed her to lead them back to him. The weight of that realization sat in her chest like a stone. "My grandfather died in 2009, she said. Her voice was steady with the particular flatness of grief that has gone cold with time. "I attended his memorial service. My mother still has his flag." "Folded flags are easy to obtain," the messenger said. "I don't know what you want me to tell you. I want you to tell me where he is. I can't tell you something I don't know." The messenger looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved his hand. The sound that followed was a safety being disengaged. One of her colleagues made a sound like a cut-off scream. The barrel of a Sig Sauer 226 standard Navy SEAL sidearm, she registered, automatically pressed against Maya's right temple. The room stopped breathing, and Maya Hargrove's world went quiet. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of perfect focus. The kind that descends when everything irrelevant simply falls away. The fluorescent hum, Patricia's half-swallowed cry, the distant sound of traffic on the interstate 4 kilometers west. All of it receded until there was nothing left but the geometry of the room, the position of 3 armed men, the distance to the nearest hardcover, the weight of a weapon she could feel but not see, pressed against the side of her head. She breathed in, she breathed out halfway. She waited between heartbeats. "Last chance," the messenger said. "I already told you," Maya said quietly. "I don't know where he is." Here is what you don't know yet. Here is the thing that changes everything you just heard. 72 hours before this moment, 3 days before the messenger and his 2 men walked through that front door, Maya Hargrove received a message. It came through a channel that didn't officially exist, to a device she kept in a fireproof box under the floorboards of her apartment, wrapped in a Faraday sleeve to prevent detection. The encryption protocol was one she and Frank had developed together 8 years earlier, during a 3-day visit in Flagstaff that her mother believed was a fishing trip. The message was 6 words long. "They're coming for you. Don't run," and then the authentication code, a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to anyone in the world except 2 people, a 26-year-old woman in Tucson and a 72-year-old man the government believed had been dead for 15 years. Signed F. Maya had sat with that message for 11 minutes. Then she had made a phone call to a number that wasn't saved in any directory and spoken 4 words 24 hours. "I'm ready." The white delivery truck parked at the far end of the street when she arrived that morning. It had been there since 5 a.m. Inside it, a surveillance package set up to monitor the entrance and begin passive tracking on any vehicle approaching the building. The laptop on her desk wasn't running logistics software. It was running a signal capture program, uploading to an encrypted server with every minute that passed. And the slight, barely perceptible tap of her finger against her watch face as she entered the conference room that had been a second signal. A backup, a fail-safe. Maya hadn't walked into that office today because of work. She had walked in because she knew they were coming. And the only way to find the person giving the orders, the person hunting her grandfather, was to let those orders find her first. She had made herself the bait. The problem with bait strategies is that they require you to remain in place long enough to be useful while not remaining in place so long that you become a casualty. Maya had made her peace with the risk. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the moment when Garrett, the 3rd man, who had been moving through the building, returned to the conference room and started toward Patricia. He was what trained people call a volatile asset, the faint tremor in his right hand. Eyes moving too fast, darting without settling. The slightly elevated pace of his breathing. He was running on something, stimulants or adrenaline or both, and that made him less predictable than the other 2, which paradoxically made him more dangerous. The messenger and Briggs were controlled. Controlled people don't pull triggers without reason. Uncontrolled people don't need one. Garrett reached down and grabbed Patricia by the arm. Patricia had photographs on her desk of two girls who looked about 6 and 8 years old. Maya made a decision. She turned slightly toward the messenger, letting the motion read as a flinch, the submissive body language of someone about to capitulate, someone searching desperately for a way out. She saw him track the movement. She saw his focus shift just for a fraction of a second to her face. In that fraction of a second, she stepped into him. The technical term for what happened next is a weapon retention break. Redirect the weapon with the non-dominant hand step inside the shooter's arm radius to neutralize the leverage advantage. Apply controlled force to the joint of the weapon hand. The whole sequence takes approximately 1.3 seconds when executed correctly. Maya executed it in just under one. The SIG 226 was in her hand before the messenger's brain had fully processed that she'd moved. She had taken 2 steps back before his body registered the absence of the weapon. She had indexed the barrel toward the floor with her free hand already raised palm out. "Everybody sit down," she said in a voice she hadn't used since the last time she'd worn a uniform. It was the voice that did not negotiate. The room sat down. Garrett had frozen mid-motion, still holding Patricia's arm. He looked at Maya, at the gun, at Maya again. "Let her go," Maya said. He let go. "Sit down." He sat down. The messenger hadn't moved. He stood precisely where she'd left him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not surprise. It was closer to confirmation, like he had brought a certain expectation into the room, and she had just fulfilled it. "You move well," he said. "I was trained well." By him. She didn't treat it like a question. "What do you actually want?" she said. "You told me you want to find my grandfather." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what you actually want." Location isn't a goal, it's a method. What's the goal? Something shifted in the messenger's eyes. A faint recalibration. "There's something he has," the messenger said. "Documentation. From a long time ago. It doesn't belong to him. And if I help you find him, everyone in this room goes home tonight." Maya looked at the photograph still sitting on the conference table. The gas station in Billings. The silver-haired man who the government had buried 15 years ago. She set the P226 on the table, slid it away from her. A gesture of compliance. A performance. "I'll need some time," she said, "to think about what I know." "You have until we reach our destination," the messenger said, "and your colleagues, released as agreed." She nodded once. She reached down and picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. As she slipped it on her right hand, passed across the face of her watch, a motion that looked like straightening a sleeve. It wasn't. It was the third signal. The one that said, "I'm mobile. Track me." She walked out of the conference room between Briggs and the messenger, through the lobby and out into the bright, flat Arizona morning. The air was warming now, the way desert air does fast and total, the heat arriving not gradually but all at once. She got into the back seat of a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates. The doors closed. The vehicle moved south. And Maya Hargrove sat in the back seat with her face perfectly still, and she counted the seconds, and she thought about a 72-year-old man in Montana who had sent her 6 words and changed everything. On a screen in a cabin on a Montana ridgeline, a small lamp burned on a rough-hewn table. A man sat in front of that screen, his hands folded, watching a red dot move steadily south through the grid lines of southern Arizona. He was 72 years old, and he had the build of someone who had once been significantly larger and had lost mass the way old soldiers do, gradually the muscle receding, the frame underneath showing through. But the frame was still substantial. Still the architecture of something that had been at one point in its history formidable in ways that had mattered in very specific places at very specific moments. Frank Hargrove had been awake since 4 in the morning. On the table beside the screen, a Barrett M82A1 lay on a clean cloth, its components separated for inspection, its bolt assembly gleaming in the lamplight. Next to it, a box of Raufoss Mark 211 multipurpose, rounds the kind designed to penetrate hardened materials before fragmenting. He hadn't touched the rifle yet. He was watching the dot. He reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and removed a plain envelope, no postmark. The name on the front written in careful block letters, Maya Hargrove. He looked at it for a while. Then he put it back. He reached for his coffee mug, found it cold, and turned back to the screen. The red dot was still moving. "Easy," he said to the empty room. He might have been talking to his granddaughter. He might have been talking to himself. Outside, the Montana wind came down off the ridge, and moved through the tops of the pine trees, and the only sound was the scream and the breathing of a man who had been waiting 15 years for this particular morning to arrive. Part 2. Don't Stay Buried. Last time we left Maya Hargrove in the back seat of a black SUV with no plates moving south through the Arizona desert. She had walked into that office knowing they were coming. She had let them take her. She had sent 3 separate signals to what she believed was a friendly surveillance unit parked 200 meters from the building. She had done everything right. Here's the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. That surveillance unit, the people she trusted, the people she had coordinated with, the people who were supposed to be tracking her signal and building the case that would unravel everything, were they actually on her side? I'll tell you the answer right now. They were not. The warehouse was 11 kilometers south of Tucson, set back from a secondary road that ran parallel to the interstate before petering out into scrubland and silence. It was the kind of building that exists in every mid-sized American city, and nobody ever thinks about a former agricultural storage facility, sheet metal walls, a concrete floor, cracked by years of thermal expansion, 6-inch gaps between the roof panels that let in blades of desert light. The SUV rolled through a side door that someone had already raised in advance. They had prepared for this. Maya noted it as she stepped out of the vehicle. Preparation meant planning. Planning meant resources. Resources meant the person behind this wasn't improvising. She was dealing with someone organized, patient, and funded the most dangerous combination in any threat assessment. The inside of the warehouse was divided by a temporary partition wall plywood on a steel frame, the kind that goes up in an afternoon. Folding tables, laptops, a portable generator humming in the corner. 6 people total, not counting the messenger Briggs and Garrett. It had the feel of an operations center that had been established recently and intended to be dismantled quickly. Maya stood in the center of the main floor and did what she always did. She read the room. Not dramatically, not obviously, just with the quiet, continuous intake of someone whose brain had been trained to treat every environment as a set of tactical variables. One exit she could see, probably a second behind the partition. The generator was loud enough to cover sound within about 30 feet. The light was uneven bright near the door's deep shadow along the eastern wall. The 2 men who weren't part of the original 3 were standing with a relaxed alertness that suggested professional training rather than hired muscle. MP5 submachine guns on slings. They knew how to carry them, which meant they knew how to use them. She counted. She calculated. She waited. The side door opened again, and everything Maya thought she understood about the situation came apart. The woman who entered was 38 years old, medium height, with the particular composed authority that comes not from rank, but from years of making difficult decisions in difficult rooms. She wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt, and she moved through the warehouse the way someone moves through a space they already own. Her name was Dana Cross. Maya knew her, not well, but enough. They had exchanged 3 encrypted messages over the preceding 2 weeks, establishing the parameters of the surveillance operation. Cross had identified herself as FBI Counterintelligence Division. She had provided authentication codes that checked out against 2 separate verification protocols. She had seemed in every measurable way exactly what she said she was. Dana Cross walked to the center of the warehouse floor and extended her hand to the messenger. He shook it. They did not introduce themselves to each other. They already knew each other. Maya stood very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a person whose threat assessment has just required a complete recalibration from the ground up. She was rebuilding the picture in a real time, replacing every assumption she had made in the last 72 hours with the correct information, and the picture that emerged was significantly worse than the one she'd been working from. Cross turned and looked at her. There was something complicated in that look. Not cruelty, not indifference, something that Maya would spend a long time trying to name, and the closest she would ever get was this, the expression of someone who made a choice they cannot undo and has been living inside the consequences of that choice for so long that the choice and the person have become the same thing. "Sit down, Maya," Cross said. "I'd rather stand." "That's fine." Cross folded her hands in front of her, a gesture that might have looked relaxed to someone who didn't know better. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you'll respond better to that than to a performance." "Appreciated. We don't need your grandfather himself. What we need is what he's been holding for 35 years. A specific set of documents, physical copies, and any digital reproductions related to a CIA operation conducted in December of 1989. Once we have confirmation that those documents have been recovered and all copies accounted for, this ends. You go back to your life. Your grandfather goes back to his whatever that looks like." And if I don't help you find him, then we find him anyway, Cross said. It just takes longer and becomes less clean. You had my communication channel, Maya said. Not quite a question. For about 9 days. So everything I sent through it, we received. Maya absorbed that. 9 days. Every coordination message, every location update, every operational detail she had passed through what she believed was a secure line. The 3 signals she'd sent that morning, the white truck that she thought was her people, all of it had been compromised before she ever used it. It meant she had come into this entirely alone. She processed all of that in approximately 4 seconds. Then she sat down. Not because she was defeated, because a seated person in a chair against a wall creates a different set of tactical options than a standing person in the middle of a room, and she needed her hands in her lap where she could work without drawing attention. The zip ties they used to secure her wrists were standard commercial restraint, not military grade. The locking mechanism on commercial zip ties, when applied quickly rather than methodically, almost always seats imperfectly on the left side of the ratchet housing. It's a 2 pound per square inch difference in tensile strength, which sounds insignificant until you apply force at precisely the correct angle and understand that the entire retention system is based on friction rather than mechanical lock. Frank had shown her this in a barn in Colorado when she was 17 years old, using a zip tie, a wooden chair, and a stopwatch. Her best time had been 2.1 seconds. She wasn't going for a record today. She sat quietly and listened and worked on the restraint slowly and visibly, with the patient progress of someone who measures effort not in seconds, but in outcomes. Cross was still talking. In December of 1989, Cross said a small element of Navy SEALs operating in support of CYA Special Activities Division was tasked with a secondary objective during the early phase of Operation Just Cause. Most Americans who were alive and paying attention in 1989 knew that name. 27,000 U.S. troops deployed to Panama. Manuel Noriega removed from power. A 13-day operation declared complete on January 3, 1990. George H.W. Bush had authorized it. The stated reasons were the protection of American citizens, the defense of the Canal Treaty, and the restoration of democracy. All of that was true. What was less discussed was what happened in the hours before the main assault began. The operations that didn't make the morning news. The smaller movements, quieter and faster, that went in ahead of the larger force to address specific targets before the situation became publicly visible. The secondary objective, Cross continued, was to access a secure records facility at a Noriega-controlled compound outside Panama City before Panamanian defense forces could destroy or relocate the contents. The CIA wanted specific documentation recovered before it was lost. What kind of documentation? Maya said. Cross looked at her for a moment. Financial records, transaction documentation, records of payments made over approximately a decade between Noriega's network and certain individuals in the United States government, military, and intelligence community. The room was quiet except for the generator. 41 names, Cross said. More or less, people who had taken money from Noriega's operation during the 1970s and 80s when he was still considered a useful asset by the CIA. People who were not going to be well served by those records becoming part of the public accounting of his fall from grace. Maya said nothing. Your grandfather was part of the team that retrieved that documentation. His instructions were to deliver everything to his CIA handler and submit his after-action report. He delivered most of it. Cross paused. He kept copies. You don't know that for certain. We know it for certain. We've known for a very long time. What we didn't know until recently was whether Frank Hargrove was actually dead or whether the 2009 accident was a fabrication. She looked at Maya steadily. Now we know. The ratchet housing on the zip tie gave a fraction of a millimeter. Maya kept her face completely still. 2 of the other men who were on that operation have died in recent years, Cross said. Natural causes, both of them. Your grandfather is the last one we can't account for. And the documentation has never surfaced, which means either he destroyed it years ago or he's still holding it. Cross tilted her head slightly. Given that he's still alive and still hiding, we lean toward the latter. Maya looked at Dana Cross, and she understood with the clarity that comes from reading a room for long enough that this woman had not always been this, that there was a version of Dana Cross who had entered the FBI believing in something real, that the person standing in this warehouse was not the person who had started out, and that the distance between those 2 people had been traveled in small steps, each one compelled by the step before it until she had arrived here and could no longer see the place she'd begun. Maya had no particular sympathy for that, but she filed it away, because understanding people is not the same as forgiving them, and understanding them is infinitely more useful. I need to think, Maya said. You have time. I'd like some water. Cross nodded at someone across the room, and in the moment that every eye shifted toward the motion of a man moving toward the table where water bottles sat, Maya broke the zip tie. The left ratchet housing had been working loose for 12 minutes. When it gave completely the way things under sustained pressure always eventually do, not gradually but all at once, a single decisive failure. Both wrists came free simultaneously. She kept her hands in her lap. She measured. One person near the east wall, shadow coverage between her current position and the partition wall. The generator running and loud. The messenger at the far table with his back partially turned. Cross looking at her phone. Briggs was guarding the main door. The door in the partition wall was 22 feet away. Maya stood up, not fast, not sudden, the controlled, purposeful movement of someone who has decided where they are going and does not require anyone's permission to go there. The man near the east wall saw her first. He got out half a word before Maya's elbow caught the side of his throat, not the trachea which collapses under direct impact and becomes a medical emergency, but the carotid bundle on the lateral side which compresses blood flow enough to produce a rapid temporary loss of coordinated motor function. He went down against the wall. She caught the MP5 as it slid off his shoulder and was moving before he reached the floor. The second man came around the partition wall at a run, hands already going to his weapon. She used the MP5 as a lever, not a gun, drove the receiver against his forearms as he raised them, stepped inside his guard, and applied controlled force at the elbow joint. The sound was unpleasant. He sat down involuntarily and stayed there. She was through the partition door before Cross had finished turning around. The space behind the partition was a secondary storage area, empty pallets coiled to hose a fire exit with a push bar that had been chained from the outside. She didn't need it. There was a gap in the sheet metal wall at the north end 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, where a panel had been improperly reattached after some earlier repair. She had noted it during her initial assessment. She hit it at an angle with her shoulder, and it gave. Outside the blinding late-morning Arizona sun, the air already past 90 degrees and climbing the scrubland flat and pale and enormous in every direction. She ran north. Behind her, she heard the warehouse door open. She heard Cross's voice, controlled and carrying, "Do not fire to kill. We need her mobile." Maya filed that away. They needed her alive and moving, which meant she was still the most important variable in this equation, which meant she still had leverage, which meant there was still a play. She ran for 6 minutes straight across scrubland and through a dry wash and up a gradual rise that gave her a sightline in 3 directions. When she reached the top, she stopped, checked her back trail, and pulled a secondary phone from the inside pocket of her jacket, a device she had taped there that morning, not inside her bag because her bag had been left in the warehouse, which was exactly what she had planned for. One number in the contacts. One person in the world outside of a man in Montana that she trusted without qualification. She pressed call. It rang twice. "I was wondering when you'd surface," the voice said. Marcus Webb sounded exactly like what he was, a man in his early 50s who had spent enough years in hard places that comfort no longer registered as a category he organized his life around. His voice was flat and deliberate, the verbal equivalent of a firm handshake. "I'm 11 clicks south of the city," Maya said. Cross was turned. A pause, brief. "How bad?" "The whole channel, 9 days." Another pause. "You're intact." "Yes, I need a pickup." "Give me a location." Marcus Webb arrived 40 minutes later in a dark blue SUV alone. He was broad across the shoulders with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of face that looks permanently unsurprised, which is a face that takes decades and specific kinds of experience to develop. He had been SEAL Team 6 DevGru in the early 90s. He had been in Mogadishu in October of 1993, which meant he had been part of Task Force Ranger during the Battle of Mogadishu, which meant he had spent 18 hours in a situation that most people never have adequate language to describe. He and Frank Hargrove had spent a significant portion of those 18 hours covering each other in conditions where the absence of that coverage would have meant neither of them came home. That kind of history doesn't just create friendship. It creates something that doesn't have a civilian equivalent. Maya had known Marcus since she was a child. He was in the way that matters most family. She got in the passenger seat and he pulled back onto the road without being asked where they were going. "Montana," she said. He nodded. They drove north in silence for a few minutes. The desert gave way slowly to higher elevation scrubland as the road climbed out of the Tucson Basin. "Tell me everything," Marcus said. She told him. The warehouse, the channel, compromise cross, and the messenger and the photographs and the documentation from Panama. She gave him the full accounting clearly and in sequence the way she had been trained to brief. No editorializing, just facts in order. Marcus listened without interrupting. He asked two clarifying questions. Both were good questions. When she finished, he nodded once and looked back at the road. She looked at him. He was driving with both hands on the wheel, which was not unusual. His right thumb moved slightly against the leather, which was also not unusual. Except, she had ridden with Marcus Webb a dozen times over the years, and she had never once seen him use his thumb that way, a small repetitive pressing motion against a specific point on the wheel. It was the motion of someone sending a haptic signal on a device mounted where a thumb naturally rests, which meant there was a device there, which meant he had been transmitting something since she got in the car. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at her hands in her lap. She did not look at him again. But behind her eyes, she was recalculating. Not in anger, not in grief, with the cold, clean arithmetic of someone who has just discovered that the tactical situation is different from the one they planned for, and who understands that the correct response to new information is not emotion. It is adjustment. Marcus was reporting to someone. She didn't know yet to whom. She didn't know yet whether he had made a choice or had a choice made for him. She didn't know the full shape of it. What she knew was this: she was in a vehicle moving north toward a man she loved and had not seen in 15 years. And the person driving was not entirely what she had believed him to be this morning. She breathed in, she breathed out halfway. She closed her eyes, and she thought about what Frank would do. On the screen in the Montana cabin, the red dot had gone mobile again after a period of stillness, which had told Frank she had gotten out of wherever they had taken her. He had allowed himself one moment of relief, a single long exhale, and then returned to what he was doing. Thinking. He was very good at thinking. It was, in some respects, the thing he was best at, though the people who had worked with him over the years would have named other skills first. Shooting, silence, endurance. The ability to remain still in uncomfortable positions for periods of time that other people found unimaginable. But underneath all of it, it had always been the thinking that made him what he was. The patient incremental accumulation of detail, and the slow construction of a picture from pieces that were never handed to you assembled. He had been building this particular picture for 35 years. On the table beside the screen, beside the Barrett and the ammunition, was a second small device, a passive tracker, no larger than a coat button. It was registered to a specific vehicle, not Maya's. Another vehicle also moving north on the same highway at a pace consistent with following rather than leading. Frank had placed that tracker himself, 6 weeks ago, underneath a vehicle that belonged to a man he had known for over 30 years, a man he had trusted with his life in the literal and not figurative sense, a man he still trusted in all the ways that mattered, and a man who had 6 months ago been placed in an impossible position by people who understood exactly which lever to pull. Frank looked at the two dots on the screen, the red one and the blue one moving alongside it. He reached into his breast pocket, took out the envelope, set it on the table, looked at Maya's name. He had written the letter inside 3 times. The first version had been too long. The second, too clinical, too much of the operator, and not enough of the grandfather. The third was the one he'd kept. It was also the one he hoped she would never need to read. He placed his hand flat on the envelope. Then he walked to the table where the Barrett lay, and began methodically reassembling it in the lamplight piece by piece, with the unhurried precision of a man who has been doing this specific thing for 50 years, and understands that preparation is not anxiety, it is respect for what is coming. Maya opened her eyes somewhere in northern Arizona, where the highway climbs through pine forest and the light changes character, less flat, more angled, coming through trees and landing in shapes on the road. She had not slept. She had been thinking about load-bearing walls. Every man has one. The one thing that if it comes under sufficient pressure doesn't just crack, it fails. And when the load-bearing wall fails, everything built on top of it comes down. She thought about Marcus Webb's life, the people in it, the one person he had mentioned over many years and in many different contexts with a frequency and a texture that signaled something essential. His nephew, 17 years old, football, a scholarship in the works. Marcus had said it once with a particular quiet pride that men of his generation use in place of more direct expressions of love. She sat with that. She did not confront him. not here in a vehicle on an open highway with no room to maneuver anything. She filed it. She labeled it. She set it in the part of her mind reserved for things to act on when conditions were right. And she watched the trees go past and thought about a man in a cabin on a ridgeline who had sent her 6 words and then gone quiet. And she thought about how much he had known when he sent them and how much more he might know now. Part 3. One shot, no second chances. 3 days ago, Maya Hargrove was a logistics employee in Tucson, Arizona. She had a desk and a coffee routine and a parking spot she always backed into. Now she was riding through the mountains of northern Montana beside a man she had come to understand was not entirely who she believed him to be, heading toward a man who had been dead for 15 years and wasn't. I want to tell you something before we reach the end. Everything that happened in that warehouse in Tucson, every choice Maya made, every signal she sent, every calculation she ran, in those 4 seconds after Dana Cross shook the messenger's hand, all of it was good work. Disciplined, precise, well-executed work. But here is what I haven't told you yet. Frank Hargrove knew this was coming. Not some of it. All of it. He had known before Maya received the 6-word message. He had known about the compromised channel. He had known about Dana Cross. He had known about Marcus. He had sent his granddaughter into it anyway. Hold that thought, because when you understand why he did it, the entire shape of the last 35 years comes into focus. And what looked like a story about a young woman with a gun and a secret becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story about what a man does with a weight he has carried alone for most of his life, and about the only person in the world he trusted enough to help him finally put it down. The dirt road into the property came off a county road that itself came off a state highway that most people in Montana had no particular reason to use. The last 14 miles were unpaved. The last 4 were what could generously be described as a road only because someone had once driven a vehicle along them with enough regularity to create 2 parallel impressions in the earth. Marcus drove those final miles slowly. Maya noticed he slowed down before the road required it. A subtle deceleration, the kind you might not notice unless you had spent years paying attention to the difference between what people do and what they should do in a given situation. She noticed. She said nothing. The cabin appeared through the trees with the abruptness that structures in dense forest always have, as if the trees had simply decided to step back and reveal it. Single-story fieldstone foundation, a woodpile stacked along the south wall that represented serious preparatory thinking about winter. A covered porch running the length of the front, a single light on inside visible through a window with the curtain drawn back on one side. Marcus stopped the vehicle 20 yards from the porch steps. The front door opened before either of them reached for their door handles. Frank Hargrove stood in the doorway. Maya had not seen him in 15 years. The last time she had seen him, she had been 11 years old and he had been 57, and already beginning to look like a man preparing himself for something he couldn't share. She had not had the language for it then. She had only known that he seemed further away in some essential sense, even when he was standing right in front of her. Now he was 72. The mask had come off him the way it comes from men who have earned it honestly and then stopped needing it. His hair was entirely white. The lines in his face were deep and numerous in the way of a topographic map of difficult terrain. But the eyes were the same deep settled stillness. The eyes of someone who had looked at genuinely hard things and had not looked away and had made his peace with what he saw. He looked at Maya for a long moment. "You're taller than I remembered," he said. "You've been dead a long time," she said. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief and was probably some combination of both. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside." She went up the porch steps. At the door, she stopped and turned back. Marcus was standing beside the vehicle with his hands at his sides, not moving toward the cabin, just standing with the expression of a man who knows that his presence is understood in a particular way and is waiting to find out what that means. Frank looked at him from the doorway, a long look, patient and without apparent anger, the look of someone who has already done the work of understanding a situation that other people are still arriving at. "Come in, Marcus," Frank said. It was not quite an invitation, not quite a command. Something in between, the kind of thing one man says to another when he is offering a door and leaving it to them whether to walk through it. Marcus walked through it. Inside, the cabin was spare and functional with the specific quality of a space organized entirely around purpose rather than comfort. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove burning low, a cot against the far wall. On the table, a laptop with a small screen showing a map, and beside it, a Barrett M. 82A1 lying on a clean cloth with the quiet authority of a tool that knows what it is for. Maya looked at the rifle. She looked at her grandfather. He was already looking at her. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you, I'll start from the beginning." December of 1989 was cold in Panama City in the way that surprises people who think of Central America as uniformly tropical. At altitude in the hours before dawn, the temperature drops to a place that gets into your bones if you're lying still in the dark in wet clothes, which Frank Hargrove had been doing for approximately 2 hours on the night of December 19th. He was 37 years old, a chief petty officer with SEAL Team 2. He had been to uncomfortable places before and would go again, and he had long since made his peace with discomfort as a professional condition. What he was not at peace with was the nature of the secondary objective handed to him 48 hours earlier by a man from Langley whose name he was never given and would not see again after that briefing. The main operation was about to begin. 27,000 American troops were going to move against Manuel Noriega's regime in what would be called Operation Just Cause, a name that managed to be both accurate and self-congratulatory in the particular way that official names for difficult things sometimes are. Noriega would be removed. Democracy restored. The canal secured. Frank's team had a different task. A records facility. A specific building in a specific compound outside the city. A set of documents inside a locked room on the second floor. Get in. Get the documents. Get out before the main assault lit up the sky and made every loyal Panamanian Defense Force soldier in the area alert and unhappy. They got in. They got the documents. 3 metal cases padlocked each with a seal Frank was specifically instructed not to break. He broke one, not during the operation. Afterward, in a safe location before the handoff. 15 minutes alone with the contents. What he read in those 15 minutes was a record of financial transactions spanning approximately 12 years organized by name and date and amount. Names he recognized. Names that were not the names of foreign nationals or cartel intermediaries. American names. People in positions that the American public believed to be staffed by people of integrity and purpose. 41 entries in the specific ledger he opened. He didn't have time to read every detail, but he read enough. He memorized the names the way he had been trained to memorize things not by repetition, but by association, building a mental architecture that connected each piece of information to something that would not decay. He resealed the case as well as he could. He delivered everything to the CIA handler. And then he went back to his room in the staging area and sat on the edge of a cot in the dark for a long time thinking about what he had read and what it meant and what he was supposed to do about it. He had no good answer to that last question, so he had done the only thing he could think to do. He had made a copy, not of everything, of enough, names, amounts, dates, written on paper encoded in a system he and 2 other people in the world could read and place somewhere that was not on his person and not connected to his official life. He had told himself he would figure out what to do with it later. Later became 5 years, then 10, then 20. And then the men who had been with him that night started dying, and the deaths had the quality of convenience about them. And Frank understood that the copy he had made was no longer a precaution, but a lifeline. As long as he had it, the people whose names were on that ledger had a reason to keep him alive long enough to find it. It was not a comfortable thing to be, but it was something. Victor Crane, Frank said. He was looking at the table when he said the name. Not at Maya, not at Marcus. At the table the way a man looks at something when he is finally setting it down after carrying it a very long time. He was on that list, not at the top, not the largest amounts, but consistent over many years. He has been nominated to a position that would give him oversight authority over multiple intelligence community functions. The confirmation is scheduled for 6 weeks from now, and he knows I'm alive. He has known for longer than you think. Maya looked at him. "How long?" she said. Frank looked at his granddaughter across the table, and something in his face shifted, not to avoid her question, but to meet it with the full weight it deserved. "Since 2009, he said. The silence in the cabin had a particular quality. Maya sat with what her grandfather had said, and she put it next to everything else she knew, and she built a structure carefully working through it in sequence until the picture was complete. Dana Cross had helped Frank disappear in 2009. Frank had gone to Cross because she was young and new and connected to someone he trusted. Cross had helped him, and then Cross had come under pressure or had made a calculation about her own survival that led her in a specific direction. And Crane had known Frank was alive since the moment Cross told him. 15 years, Maya said. 15 years, Frank confirmed. He could have moved sooner. He chose not to. Why? Because a dead man can't produce documentation. And a dead man can't be followed to where the documentation is. As long as he knew I was alive, and I didn't know he knew I was useful to him as a source he could eventually locate and exploit. He paused. What changed his timeline was the confirmation hearing. 6 weeks. He doesn't have the luxury of patience anymore. Maya thought about Dana Cross in that warehouse. The complicated expression. The woman who had walked a long road from wherever she had started. She's not doing this because she wants to, Maya said. No, Frank said. She isn't. And Marcus. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Marcus Webb had not spoken since they came inside. He was sitting in the second chair with his hands on his knees, and he was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has been anticipating a specific moment for some time and has now arrived at it and finds that anticipation and arrival are very different experiences. Frank looked at him with the same expression he had used at the door. Patient, without anger, the expression of someone who has already done the work of understanding. His nephew, Frank said quietly. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. 17 years old, smart kid, football scholarship in the works. About 6 months ago, someone made it very clear to Marcus that the boy's future was a variable that depended on Marcus's cooperation. Maya looked at Marcus. Marcus opened his eyes and looked back at her. There was nothing in his expression that asked for absolution. He was not a man who asked for things he didn't think he had earned. But there was something there that was in the specific register of a person who made a choice they would not make again if the choice presented itself differently, but who was also not certain they would have made a different one given the same conditions. I'm sorry, he said. Maya looked at him for a long time. She thought about 18 hours in Mogadishu. She thought about the particular arithmetic of loyalty that forms in conditions most people never encounter, the kind that doesn't dissolve easily under pressure, but can be redirected. She thought about a 17-year-old kid with a scholarship in the works and a future that someone had decided to use as a weapon. She turned back to Frank. How long have you known about Marcus? Frank reached into his breast pocket. He placed the envelope on the table, and beside it, a second piece of paper folded once. He slid the second paper toward her. It was a handwritten note dated 3 weeks earlier. 2 sentences. The first named Marcus Webb. The second described the nature of the pressure being applied to him. At the bottom, a source notation in Frank's encoded system. Maya read it twice. Set it down. You knew, she said. Before you sent me the message, you knew about Marcus. You knew about Cross. You knew the channel was burned. Yes. She stood up from the table. Not in panic. In the controlled, deliberate way she stood up from every situation that required her to put distance between herself and her next response. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the tree line. The same tree line she had come down from an hour from now, in a version of events that hadn't happened yet but was already forming. Frank waited. He was good at waiting. I had the right to know, she said, still facing the window. Yes, you did. If you had told me about Marcus, I would have handled it differently. I know. You didn't trust me to handle it. I trusted you completely, Frank said. That's not why I didn't tell you. He paused, and what followed was not a justification, but something harder, the truth told plainly by a man who is done with all other versions. I didn't tell you because if you'd known, you would have protected him. You would have found another path that kept Marcus clear of all of it, and Marcus needed to make his own choice without anyone making it easier for him. His voice was quiet and level, and not apologetic in the way of people who are performing contrition, but in the way of people who have arrived at a truth they wish had been different. I was right about that, but it still wasn't mine to decide. She turned around. She looked at her grandfather, this 72-year-old man who had spent 15 years alone in a cabin, keeping a secret that was slowly becoming heavier than any person should carry alone, and who had trusted her enough to build the entire final act around her capability, and who had also made the decision for her without asking. Both things were true at the same time. Don't do that again, she said. No, he said, I won't. She came back to the table and sat down. There is one more thing you don't know, Frank said. He folded his hands. Something I need you to understand before what happens next happens. She waited. Crane sent those men to Tucson because he'd lost Frank's signal. He needed you to lead him here, and I let that happen. I built the situation so that it would happen, so that he would follow you here, to this valley, to this cabin on terrain that I chose, and know in the dark, and he doesn't. Frank looked at her steadily. I have been setting this up for 6 weeks. The sensor positions the approach road, your ridge placement, the window of preparation. Everything. He paused, including the fact that Marcus would bring him. The room was very quiet. You engineered all of it, Maya said slowly. Not just the message. All of it. Yes. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at Frank with an expression that was not anger and not surprise, but something in between, the look of a man realizing that the shape of what he had been part of is larger than he understood. He knew you were under pressure, Maya said to Marcus. He left you room to make the choice yourself, and he built the whole plan around what you would do. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, he always did that. Frank looked at the table. I've been carrying that ledger for 35 years, he said. I've watched those names accumulate power. I watched two of my teammates die in circumstances that were too convenient. I watched Crane's nomination announcement, and I understood that the window I had been waiting for had finally arrived, not because I had grown brave, but because there was finally no other option. He looked up. I needed it to end, and to end it, I needed to bring it here where I have the advantage. I needed someone I could trust absolutely on that ridge. There is only one person in the world I trust absolutely. He looked at Maya. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then the first sensor at the 2-kilometer mark sent its signal to the device on the edge of Frank's table, and the table vibrated once and everything changed. 23 minutes, Frank said, give or take. He stood up. Maya was already moving toward the door when she stopped. She had Cross's number. Not the official line, the secondary number Cross had used during their original coordination 9 days ago before Maya knew the channel was burned. The number still worked. The person on the other end had spent 9 days being afraid of the wrong things. 30 seconds to make a decision. She pulled the backup phone, dialed. Cross picked up on the second ring. I'm not calling to negotiate, Maya said. I'm calling because Frank told me what happened in 2009. I know how it started. I know how it became what it became. She paused. You went into the FBI because you believed in something. I don't know how much of that is left, but if any part of it is still there, I'm giving you coordinates right now. You show up on the right side or you don't show up at all. Your choice. 3 seconds of silence on the line. Send them, Cross said. Maya sent them. Ended the call. Frank watched her from across the room without expression. She might not come, Maya said. No, Frank said. She might not. But you would have done the same thing. He considered it. Yes, I would have. He opened the wooden box under the table and removed 2 Beretta M9 pistols, 4 spare magazines, and a K-bar with a handle worn smooth from years of handling. He set 1 pistol in front of Marcus and kept the second on the edge of the table closest to Maya. I'm going to trust you one more time, he said to Marcus. That's your decision to do something with or not. Marcus looked at the weapon on the table. He looked at Frank. He nodded once the way men of their particular background nod when words are insufficient and action is the only adequate language. Frank turned to Maya and handed her the second M9. Ridge first, sidearm secondary. You know the order. She tucked the Beretta into her jacket. Then Frank picked up the Barrett M8 2A1 and held it for a moment, and he looked at his granddaughter across the small space of the cabin with the lamp burning low between them, and for a moment the operational quality left his face entirely, and there was just the man underneath it, the man who had written that letter 3 times trying to say the right thing and had never quite gotten there. When this is done, he said, no more closed doors. She looked at him. Every question you have, he said. Every one. She picked up the Barrett from his hands. Hold the cabin, old man, she said. She walked out the door. The Western Ridge was a 12-minute climb through dense spruce and pine over terrain that alternated between packed earth and loose shale. Maya moved fast and quiet, the Barrett slung across her back, the weight of it familiar, in the way that the weight of a rifle is never entirely familiar, but becomes integrated part of your body's accounting of itself in space. She found the position Frank had described, a natural depression in the rock face waist deep with a flat shelf of stone at the right height and a clear sight line down through the trees to the road approach 680 meters below. She went prone. She set the bipod. She pulled the rifle into her shoulder and found the scope picture and let her eye adjust to the magnification, the way you let your eyes adjust to darkness, not forcing it, just allowing it. 4 degrees Celsius. She could feel it in her hands and the skin across her cheekbone where it rested against the stock. Cold slows the powder burn slightly. Cold air is denser, which affects drag differently than warm air. The ballistic solution changes, not dramatically, but enough that the person who doesn't account for it misses and the person who does doesn't. She ran the numbers in her head. 680 meters, 50 caliber B, MG muzzle velocity, approximately 2,900 feet per second at standard temperature. At 4 Celsius reduce approximately 2%. Wind at 12 miles per hour from the northwest. At her position, she read the target end from the movement of the tree line along the road below. Similar, perhaps slightly less in the draw, elevation drop from ridge to road, approximately 60 meters higher than the road, angle of fire compensate accordingly. She adjusted the turrets on the Leupold Mark IV, elevation first, then windage. Each click 1/4 MOA. She counted them. Confirmed. Then she settled. She breathed. She waited. The first vehicle appeared at the 2-kilometer mark 9 minutes later. A black SUV moving at the purposeful, unhurried speed of people who have somewhere specific to be and have prepared for the journey. Behind it, a second vehicle slightly larger with the roofline modification of a car that has been reinforced close protection work, the kind done to vehicles used by people who take their own security seriously. 2 in the first vehicle, 3 visible in the second, 5 visible, possibly more. She thought about Victor Crane, 58 years old, a man who had spent his professional life in the architecture of other people's decisions, managing from a distance, with the patience of someone accustomed to it. A man who had put his name on a ledger in Panama 35 years ago and had spent every year since building the kind of power that makes ledgers irrelevant. But power has a problem. It requires maintenance. It requires the continued suppression of the things that could undo it. And every year you don't address those things, they grow heavier and more dangerous. Crane had known about Frank for 15 years and had chosen patience. The confirmation hearing had ended his patience. He was in one of those vehicles. She knew it the way she knew certain things, not from evidence, but from the accumulated understanding of a situation studied from every angle. He had come himself because you don't send someone else to collect the thing your entire future depends on. She waited. She breathed. The first vehicle entered the final approach where the dirt road narrowed between 2 stands of spruce, and there was no room to turn and no option but forward. Maya exhaled halfway. She placed the crosshairs on the engine block of the first vehicle, not on any person inside it. She had made her decision about this on the climb up the ridge, and the decision was this. Her job was to stop movement and create conditions, not to determine outcomes. The Barrett would stop a vehicle engine from 680 meters as reliably as it stopped anything else. She did not need to make other choices to accomplish that. She pressed the trigger between heartbeats. The rifle moved against her shoulder with the controlled authority of a half-inch diameter projectile departing at near supersonic velocity and 680 meters away, and approximately 0.6 of a second later, the engine block of the first SUV experienced a mechanical event from which it would not recover. The vehicle stopped, hard and complete. The second vehicle braked sharply behind it. Maya was already working the bolt. The second vehicle began to reverse, the driver reacting correctly, creating distance, reassessing. She put the next round into its engine before it had traveled 8 feet. Both vehicles, stationary on a road with tree line on one, searched in a steep embankment on the other. Doors opening, she counted. 2 from the first, 3 from the second. 5 total moving to cover in the tree line, low and fast trained movement, using the terrain correctly. She marked their positions. She watched. 2 of the 5 began moving through the trees toward the cabin on the eastern side of the approach, the side she could not cover from this ridge. Frank's problem and Marcus's. She had to trust that. She tracked the remaining 3 who established positions in the tree line and set up a firing line toward the cabin suppression while the other 2 moved. She waited until one of the 3 made the mistake that people in field positions eventually make, the small adjustment, the momentary exposure that comes from being still too long in an uncomfortable position and prioritizing relief over discipline. She pressed the trigger. She worked the bolt. She waited. The other 2 did not make the same mistake. But they did not advance either. They held their positions, suppressed, unable to move forward, and unwilling to expose themselves. Then from the cabin below and to her right, she heard the flat crack of a Beretta M9 fired twice in rapid succession. Then a third shot, then silence. The 2 remaining figures in the tree line stayed where they were for approximately 90 seconds. Then they stood, both of them with their hands visible and away from their bodies, in the universal language of people who have concluded that the situation has resolved in a way that does not favor continued resistance. Victor Crane was standing beside the second vehicle when Maya came down from the ridge. He was 58 years old, and he looked it in the way that powerful men sometimes look their age suddenly and all at once, as if the years had been waiting patiently behind the authority and had only now been permitted to show. He was wearing a dark overcoat that was not appropriate for Montana in March, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the cabin with an expression difficult to read from a distance. Frank came out of the cabin first. He walked across the open ground between the cabin and the road with the unhurried directness of a man who has been waiting for this particular conversation for 35 years and sees no reason to delay it further. He stopped 15 feet from Crane. The two men looked at each other. Maya stopped 20 feet back, and to Frank's right, the Barrett no longer in her hands, but the Beretta from her jacket ready within reach. She watched. She let Frank have what had been his for 35 years. "You look well," Crane said, for a dead man. "You look tired," Frank said, for a man who's been winning. Crane looked at him for a long moment. "I want the documentation," Crane said. His voice had lost its boardroom quality. What was underneath it was older and more ordinary, just a man who had been afraid for a very long time and was tired of it. "Whatever form it's in, everything, and your confirmation that there are no additional copies." And in exchange, Frank said, "This stops. Your granddaughter goes back to her life. You go back to whatever this is." He glanced at the cabin. "I'm not unreasonable, Frank. I never wanted it to come to this. You sent people to put a gun to her head. I sent people to ask her a question." "You know the difference between those two things," Frank said. "You've always known the difference. That's what makes you dangerous." Crane looked at him. "The documentation," he said. "Please." Frank reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He removed a small hard drive. He held it in his palm, looking at it the way a man holds something he has carried a long time when he is finally ready to set it down. 41 names, Frank said. 12 years of transactions. 3 separate intelligence community operations compromised for personal financial benefit. He looked up at Crane. "Including yours. You weren't the largest, but you were consistent, and you were patient. I'll give you that." Crane said nothing. "You know what I kept thinking about all these years," Frank said. "I kept thinking about December of 1989. I kept thinking about the reasons we gave for being in Panama, and what was underneath those reasons, and what was inside those cases we recovered, and what it meant that some of the people making the decisions about when and where and how had financial relationships with the man we were there to remove." He closed his hand around the hard drive. "That's what I kept. Not for leverage. I want you to understand that. I kept it because somebody needed to, and I was there, and I was the only one who looked." A sound behind them, gravel under a footstep. Dana Cross came around the far side of the second vehicle. She was holding her FBI credentials in one hand and a pair of handcuffs in the other, and her face had the expression Maya had tried to name in the warehouse and had filed away for later. She had a name for it now. It was the expression of someone who has decided after a very long time to stop being afraid. "Victor Crane," her voice was steady and clear in the cold Montana air. "I'm placing you under arrest." Crane looked at her, at the credentials, at the handcuffs, then at Maya. "You called her," he said. "During the 23 minutes, Maya said. "I gave her a choice." Crane looked back at Cross. "On whose authority?" he said. "Mine," Cross said. "And then a few other people I've been on the phone with for the last 4 hours." She looked at him with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to lose. "It turns out that when you tell the truth after a long time of not telling it, people tend to listen. That's been my experience this afternoon." She stepped toward him. Crane looked at Frank one final time. The look of a man searching for something, an argument, and opening some version of this ending that goes differently. He didn't find it. What he found instead was the face of a man who had made his peace with hard things decades ago and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to finish arriving at what he had already accepted. Frank said nothing. Some things don't require a final word. Cross put the handcuffs on. Afterward, in the particular quiet that follows the end of something that has been a long time coming, Maya sat on the porch steps of the cabin and watched the light change in the Montana sky. It was late afternoon, the sun low. The light, that long gold angled light that only comes at the end of the day at northern latitudes, the kind that makes everything it touches look like it's being examined honestly one last time before the dark. Marcus sat on the steps beside her. They didn't speak for a while. "The kid," Maya said finally. "He's fine," Marcus said. "He doesn't know any of this happened." "Good." Silence. "I should have told you," Marcus said. "Yes. I know." She looked at her hands. "You are going to have to tell everything you know to a lot of people in suits," she said. "For a long time." "I know that too. Frank will help where he can." Marcus nodded slowly, then quietly without decoration. He's a better man than I've been lately. Maya thought about 18 hours in Mogadishu. She thought about what it takes to be a specific kind of person for a long time under conditions that would make a different person into something else, and about how the difference between those outcomes is not strength exactly, or not only strength, but something quieter and harder to name. You came back, she said. He looked at her. When it counted, she said, you came back. He looked away, but something in his posture settled slightly, the way a structure settles when a weight it has been carrying is redistributed to where it belongs. Inside the cabin, she could hear Frank moving around. The sounds of an old soldier in a small space, deliberate, minimal, no wasted motion. She got up from the steps and went inside. He was at the wood stove, adding a piece of split pine. The fire had burned down during the afternoon and the cabin had gotten cold the way mountain structures do. Suddenly and completely, as if warmth were a decision that requires constant renewal. He didn't turn around. I owe you a conversation, he said. You owe me about 15 years of conversations. Yes. He set another piece of wood on the fire and closed the stove door. I know. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her. Between them, the small lamp made a circle of light that reached just far enough to include both their faces. She looked at him. The letter, she said. He reached into his breast pocket, set the envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. What does it say? It says I'm sorry for leaving, he said. It says I was afraid not of the people looking for me, of pulling you into something I couldn't guarantee the outcome of. He looked at the envelope. It says I knew from the time you were 8 years old standing in that field with a rifle that was too big for you that you were going to be remarkable. And I didn't know whether to be proud of that or heartbroken by it, because remarkable people tend to get called on in ways that the rest of us don't, and I wasn't sure I had the right to teach you those things knowing what they might eventually cost you. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the tops of the pines. You had the right, Maya said. He looked at her. You had the right, she said again. I'm not saying every choice you made was the right one, but the teaching was. Everything you put in me that was right. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the envelope. He held it over the open lamp, and the paper caught and burned with the clean, quick brightness of something that no longer needs to exist, and he set the small remaining ash in the tray beside the lamp. He looked at the table. No more closed doors, he said. No more closed doors, she said. Outside, the Montana night was coming down cold and full of stars, the particular stars of high altitude, and no light pollution. More stars than most people in the modern world ever see, a whole enormous darkness and full of light that has been traveling for longer than any human concern, indifferent and beautiful and utterly without agenda. The next morning she was up before dawn, not because she needed to be, because she had never successfully slept past 4 in the morning in her adult life, and she had stopped fighting it around the same time she had stopped fighting the weight of a rifle. She climbed back to the western ridge as the sky lightened over the valley. The same position she had been in the afternoon before, but without the Barrett this time. Just herself in the cold air and the slow arrival of the light. She sat with her back against the rock face and looked out across the valley below the road winding through the trees, pale and empty. In the early morning, the ridgeline on the far side still in shadow. The world at this hour had the quality of something not yet decided, still in the process of becoming. Her phone vibrated, unknown number. A message, no sender identification. 4 words. Good job. Stay ready. She looked at the message for a long moment. She thought about 41 names in a ledger from 1989. 1 arrested. 40 remaining somewhere in the architecture of things, in positions built over decades with the patience of people who have never needed to hurry. She thought about confirmation hearings that would now not happen, and about the reverberations that would follow from that, the investigations, the careful silences, the quiet rearrangements of power that occur when one thread is pulled and people begin to wonder what else is connected to it. She thought about a phone that could be turned on or left face down, about a ridge that was empty now but had been useful yesterday and could be useful again, about a grandfather in a cabin below who had been waiting 15 years for the right moment to put something down, and about what it meant that he had chosen her to stand beside him when he finally did. She thought about 8 years old in a field in New Mexico and the ring of a steel plate in the morning air. Some answers don't need to be given immediately. Some questions you sit with, you breathe through, you hold in the space between heartbeats until the conditions are right and you know what you actually want to say. Then you decide. She turned the phone face down on the rock beside her. She looked out at the valley. She breathed in the cold Montana air, sharp and clean and honest, the kind of air that shows you exactly what things are, and she felt for the first time in 3 days something that wasn't exactly peace, but was close enough to it that she wasn't going to argue about the distinction. Below through the trees, a light came on in the cabin window. Frank was awake. Of course he was. When they pressed that gun to her head in a conference room in Tucson, three men saw what they expected to see. A young woman, small, apparently ordinary, apparently alone. They did not see 18 years of mornings in open fields. They did not see the patience that had been placed inside her like a foundation stone before she was old enough to understand what it was for. They did not see the 72-year-old man 1,400 miles north who had spent 15 years alone in a cabin keeping a secret that was slowly becoming heavier than any one person should carry alone, waiting for the right moment and the right conditions and the right person to stand beside him at the end. Victor Crane is awaiting a federal hearing. The documentation Frank Hargrove carried for 35 years is in the hands of people whose job it is to do something with it. Dana Cross made her choice finally after 15 years of making a different one. Marcus Webb sat across from a lot of people in suits and told the truth, which is the heaviest thing a person can carry, and also, in the end, the only thing that actually sets you free. Frank Hargrove is still in Montana. He is, as far as official records are concerned, still dead. That situation is under review. And Maya Hargrove sat on a ridge in Glacier County in the early morning light and did not answer the message on her phone because she understood that some conversations have a time and a place, and this was not yet it. But she also understood something else. She understood that the man who taught her to shoot had also taught her something more important. He had taught her that the most dangerous people are not the loudest ones in the room. They are not the ones with the most weapons or the most resources or the most authority. They are the ones who are still standing when everyone else has run out of patience. The gun is not the weapon. It never was. You never threaten a Navy SEAL. But what those three men in Tucson never understood, what Victor Crane never understood in 35 years of trying to outmaneuver a man in a Montana cabin, is that you never threaten the person a Navy SEAL spent their entire life making sure could take care of themselves. Because that person was taught by the best. And the best taught them that patience is the weapon. The gun is just the last part of a very long conversation. And some conversations, when they finally end, have been worth every year of waiting.